So to get us started, I have a thought experiment for y'all. I want you to look at my computer for 1 second. So I want you to imagine that I have ordered everyone in the entire United States from the least wealthy to the most wealthy. And then once I've ordered them, I've divided them all into 5 groups, ranging from what the first quintile is the lowest 20%, the lowest 1/5 of people who have the least wealth in the country, and the 5th quintile is the highest wealth, the richest people, the wealthiest people in the country. So by dividing up people this way, there are the same number of people in each bucket. So each bucket has 1/5 of the people in the United States, and they're ordered from least to most wealthy. Now, what I want you to do is imagine that you are dictator, emperor, empress of the United States, and you get to pick what is the distribution of wealth in the United States. So you could pick a very unequal distribution of wealth. You could say all of the money goes to the top 20% and the other buckets get nothing. Or you could ask for a very equal distribution of wealth, that each of these buckets of people is 20% of the people, so each of them could get about 20% of the wealth, or something in between. So this is just like an attitude. This is an attitude around what you think the ideal wealth distribution is going to be. So while you're thinking about that, the other thing that we could ask is, well, what is your perception? What do you think actually is the case in the United States today? So let's take a look at what the class said. Sarah, do you have results? Let's look at people's ideal distribution of wealth first. What did they say should happen in the United States?
If you take a look at my computer, you can see that the class favored a relatively equal distribution of wealth, with no more than 28% of the wealth going to any quintile.
So some gradation, some inequality there, but nothing too extreme. And then what about their estimates of what is actually the case in the United States? What did they say?
They estimated a lot more inequality. In fact, they estimated that the top quintile would have about 55% of the wealth, and that the bottom quintile would have about 7% of the wealth.
Really interesting, because it fits with national surveys. So if you ask nationally representative groups of Americans about their ideal wealth distribution and their perception of the current wealth distribution in the United States, you find results that look very similar to this. And what's remarkable is that many of the things that we might think would predict either these perceptions or these attitudes actually turn out to be not that predictive. So we had someone in the chat say, well, we're young, you know, we live in a left-leaning city, I'm queer, like I put equal. But when we look at surveys, those exact variables actually don't really predict much of the differences in people's ideal distributions of wealth. So when we compare young to old, when we compare people who identify as men versus women, when we compare college educated to non-college educated, actually across all of those demographic groups, we see people say that their ideal distribution of wealth is very similar to what the class average was, which is a little bit of inequality, but like a graded distribution. So this is an example where I think some of our common sense intuitions about what factors are going to shape people's attitudes turn out to be not nearly as strong in practice as we might imagine them to be. So I'm going to show you some data from my computer really quickly, if you want to look at this. So this is the data that we see when we look at nationally representative surveys. The ordering of this is the opposite order as we were previously starting. So the blue bar are the wealthiest Americans, that's on the left, and then it's shading into the purple bars, which are the poorest Americans, on the right. So if you look at that bottom line here, this is what people say on average is the ideal distribution of wealth in America, and it's very similar to what y'all said on average, which is that most people say that the wealthiest 20% of people should have about 30% of the wealth. And then if you look at that second bar, you can see these are people's perceptions of what's actually happening in America, and people perceive that between 50 and 60% of the wealth is owned by that wealthiest quintile. So that blue bar is taking about half of the wealth of America, and then it's distributed all the way through the rest of the groups. And again, that's very consistent with what y'all perceived. On the top bar, we have the actual distribution of wealth in America, which is the top 20% of Americans own more than 80% of the wealth. And you might notice something really interesting about this graph. The bottom two purple boxes, the lowest 40% of Americans are not even on the graph, and that is because they own essentially none of the wealth in America. So I think what we have here is a really interesting thing in which we have both ideals, values, attitudes that are maybe less variable than we might imagine. We have perceptions of reality, and then those perceptions don't necessarily match what's going on in society writ large.